and welcome to Getting to Know Japan, the Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Professor Nathaniel Smith, who will be presenting on political extremism. Professor Nathaniel Smith is an anthropologist of Japan and an associate professor in the College of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. He holds degrees from Yale, Waseda, and the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Smith is a former Japan Foundation Fellow and a member of the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. Professor Smith, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you for having me, and it's really nice to get a chance to join you all again. I'm going to share my screen and just hop right in. So is that visible for everybody? Great. So the title of my talk is Political Extremism in Japan, and I'm going to briefly give a few examples of what might be considered political extremism. Then I'll talk about different varieties of activism that has been classed in that realm over the last several decades. And then I'll move to what my specific research interest is, which is in far-right activist groups. And I'll tell you a little bit about the shift in far-right activism in Japan, basically from the post-World War II period until a few days ago, or something like that. I'll try to keep myself to the time limit of 30 minutes, but if I don't, I imagine I'll get a warning at some point. I look forward to hearing all of your comments and questions and answering as many as I can. So this guy is a pretty major figure on the far right in Japan, Nomura Shusuke. You can see that he passed away in 1993, but he made quite a name for himself before that. The first thing that he did that really got himself some national attention was here, July 15th, 1963. He burned the house down of then construction minister Kono Ichiro, Kono Taro's grandfather, to protest policies that the LDP was pursuing and to kind of make his voice heard outside of sort of more mainstream ways of having a political conversation. At the time, Nomura was acting not as a political activist, but as a member of organized crime. And that's something that's an important distinction we'll come back to later. He went to jail for arson and was in prison for 12 years. And when he came out, he found some brethren in political activism, and he started sort of pursuing work not as an organized crime member, but as an activist. But just a few years later, he went back to prison again. So this was in March 1977. He, with a number of guys from his group, at this point, political activist group, took hostages at the Japan Business Federation. And they were doing it with what seemed to be an explicitly sort of populist intention. They were saying that it was too bad that the average salary man had to commute for 2 hours into his job in central Tokyo and couldn't afford to buy a house and things like that, and that the Japan Business Federation needed to help the working man, right? Went back to prison, as you can see, for 6 years. When he came back out in the 1980s, he was something of this dandy figure who was uniting far-right people and kind of counterculture people and organized crime people. And in fact, in the late 80s, early 90s, made some moves into politics. So this was a political poster for his party, the Party of the Wind, Kaze no Kai. And you can see, if you might recognize some of the faces, people like Dave Spector of American Talent, who's still on TV. You've got some pro wrestlers, you've got some singers, you've got Sugawara Bunta, the famous Yakuza role actor. You've got Beat Takeshi, right? They didn't win their elections when none of the candidates that they fielded made a dent in Japanese electoral politics. But during the election, they were made fun of. And the Kaze no Kai, you can see here if you remove this red stripe on the character here and take out that stroke, it becomes not Kaze but Shirami. so a louse instead of the wind. And in a political cartoon, they were pilloried as the party of lice, right? This really, really angered Nomura. He had these pure intentions of righting the wrongs of Japanese society. If you take a look at the list of their tenets down there, that we're going to fight against great evil, that we're against politics that doesn't have principles or like weak-kneed diplomacy, that we want young people to have pride in their country, right? And then to be pilloried really pissed him off. And the next year, in 1993, he took hostages again, this time at the Asahi newspaper, kind of considered to be on the left of Japan's major dailies. And after taking hostages for a while and voicing his complaints, killed himself at the Asahi newspaper. So that, I think, is kind of a useful example of political extremism, existing kind of on the edges of mainstream Japanese politics, being part of the domestic conversation in different kinds of ways than, say, writing editorials or things like that, but kind of bouncing back and forth between things that are pretty palatable, right, and things that are pretty extreme. And so most of the groups that have been involved in extreme politics in Japan have had phases of different forms of activism, and sometimes shifting across a generation of activists, sometimes shifting between a group and an individual member, something like that. So when I first came to Japan, I lived at Sophia University, which is right in the middle of Tokyo. And for those of you that were in Japan 20 years ago, you saw these trucks quite frequently. This is a sound truck. It's from a right-wing group. And you can see their speakers on top. They're quite loud. I'll play an example of it in just a little bit. These trucks were kind of fascinating to me. I was wondering who these people are. They spend all sorts of money, all sorts of time, all sorts of energy putting themselves in the public eye, and yet they weren't really getting any traction, right? People were kind of averting their eyes and trying not to listen to them, and yet they were very, very prominent. That's shifted over recent years, and now there's a much more sort of online, digital world for right-wing politics, but at the time, it was very street-based, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So that was my first kind of introduction to political extremism in Japan. And it was curious to me. They look really scary. They look like they're ready to crash into a barricade and run somebody down, right? They sound really horrible. And as a young student, you're thinking, gosh, I thought Japan was this peaceful place without conflict. And here people are screaming at the top of their lungs about things that I can only barely begin to decipher. In terms of the definition of political extremism in Japan, though, oftentimes it's something that is used to describe the far left, not the far right. So terms in Japanese to describe the far left are things like kagekiha, right, the more extreme faction. Again, implying that there is a less extreme faction using sort of traditional ways of trying to affect political change. So the kagekiha is a difference in degree, right? Or another phrase would be kyokusa boryoku shudan, right? Violent, extreme left-wing groups, right? And if you've noticed perhaps at train stations or on koban, police boxes, there's still posters, wanted posters for people who committed political crimes, even as far back as the late 60s and 1970s, right? So where are these people coming from? 1968, student movement. Again, this was a very mainstream thing. Most Japanese universities had really active student movements, but some factions moved out and got involved in more extreme politics, more extreme methods, right? If not politics. If you're interested in that period and the ephemera of it, you can still sometimes find the helmets that different factions created on Yahoo auctions and things like that. Every once in a while, people who have collected these sorts of things let them go out into the world. But in terms of sort of the relation to the Japanese authority and Japanese police, this is a blurb from the National Police Agency. When police in Japan talk about political extremism, they're often defining it in terms of the left and not the right. That's not to say that what the right is doing is not extreme, but that relationship to authority is sort of a key factor. These kinds of things are also operational over generations. So just in 2022, Kusako Shikenobu, who was as was pointed out in this Al Jazeera article, notorious in the 70s and 80s when she was a member of the Japanese Red Army in these far left factions. She was finally released after duly serving her time and was sort of treated to fanfare and some I don't know, disdain for rehashing the old politics of a more extreme time. So I mentioned that for the left, you would often hear kyokusa boryoku shudan, so like extremely violent left-wing groups or far left-wing groups. For the right, oftentimes you get a slightly more euphemistic descriptor, which is seiji undo, that they are political organization or political activism, like far-right political activism, not far-right violent political extremism, right? What does this look like? I mentioned the sound trucks. These would be in parades. These would be riding around the city. These would be targeting particular businesses or newspapers or embassies, right? If you have spent time near the Russian embassy on August 9th, for instance, you've seen these trucks circling and circling. But also you can see this sort of like military-esque demeanor, right? The uniforms, that kind of the trappings of a military that from their perspective doesn't exist in Japan any longer, right? And they would say that the self-defense force is sort of forced upon them by the United States. They hope to be this sort of ready to strike force. What about more recently? There are also issue-based groups that in some cases have been classed as or been feared for their potential to become more extremist. So after 9/11, we had really, really active anti-nuclear movements in Japan. For a long time, people said that Japanese young people in particular didn't care about politics and had moved away from politics. They were suffering from heiwa boke, or peace senility, things like this. But after the triple disaster in 2011, there was a really active protest movement, anti-nuclear movement, that took all sorts of different forms. None of it became particularly violent or extreme, but Japanese authorities and people on the right were kind of ready for it to do that, although it didn't. Another example would be the SEALDS, the Students' Emergency Action to Protect Liberal Democracy. This was in 2015. It kind of popped up and then disappeared in opposition to then Prime Minister Abe's reinterpretation of the ability for Japanese self-defense force to participate in collective self-defense with the US military, right? We can talk about those examples later in the Q&A if you like. Even more recently, right, would be around the 2020 election. You heard from Levy last session about that, and we can, again, talk about that some more. But the question of sort of the parallels and interactions between, say, far-right groups in the United States and far-right groups in Japan, sometimes through a religious lens, right? Pro-Trump rallies, Stop the Steal marches, QAnon, JAnon, General Flynn groups in Japan. These kinds of things have been cropping up, right? Through the bounty of the World Wide Web, I suppose. And then lastly, just in this period that hopefully, knock on wood, we're coming out of, during COVID, there was sort of this nascent COVID-resistant kind of movement. Sometimes it got pretty extreme. And again, these overlap with the JAnon, QAnon type people, like going to hospitals and not wearing masks and doing kind of what they saw as direct action to exert themselves, right? So Levy talked about, I'm sure, Prime Minister Abe's assassination and perhaps Kishida most recently, the pipe bomb. But basically, the reason why I run through those real quickly is to say that these kinds of things that can take the form of extremism come from all different political stripes in Japan, just like anywhere in the world. And for somebody who's interested in the far right in Japan, what I'm sort of most always impressed by or fascinated by is sort of the staying power of right-wing groups. Perhaps we can talk about this, but they're not necessarily sanctioned by the government or police, but seeing their role in society in a slightly different frame than perhaps a far left-wing group would see them. So I want to transition and talk about my particular research interest around the far right in Japan. There's a link to an article that gets into some of this and a PDF if anybody's interested in further reading. So the right in the Heisei period, from basically the end of the 1980s until just a couple of years ago, was really trying to struggle with this number 10 here at the end. How to enact a normal nationalism, right? Is it normal to ride around in big sound trucks and scream at people? Maybe not, right? The Cold War ends, so your Cold War enemies disappear, maybe. Your Cold War inspiration changes quickly. The revenues that you had built your activism around switch, right? You have your relationship to notions of marginality in Japanese society, we can talk about later, to policing, to the political establishment. Are your benefactors conservative politicians, or are you there to critique the conservative politicians, right? You have domestic diversity within the right that's kind of getting recalibrated in the 1990s and the 2000s and 2010s. You have demographic change as people are aging out of the kind of activism that they used to be part of. You have domestic connections and conflict with other political movements. You have changes in US-Japan relations, North-South Korea and Chinese relations. And along those lines, you have both cooperation and conflicts with other kinds of nationalisms, both in the Northeast Asian region as well as internationally. And I'll describe a little bit of that in a moment. Over the same time period over the last 30 years, you have really, really rapid technological change, which spurs change in the way that activists pursue their activism, right? How do you use the internet? What's a good way to be an activist? Is it good to be out on the street and talking with your megaphone, or is it better to have a YouTube channel, right? And get followers and retweets on Twitter or something like this, right? And then how to respond to emergent movements. During the Cold War, it was really easy for right-wing groups to say, we are anti-communist. That's our main thing, right? But when the Berlin Wall falls, it gets a bit harder to use that as this motivating principle. So when things like historical revisionism is happening in the late 1990s in Japan, and there's a big movement around that, when things like demand for redress of comfort women issues, things like that are happening, when things like the Iraq War, first and second version is happening, again, 311, things like hate speech, anti-hate speech regulations, the global rise of a populist right. It's a tricky question to understand as an activist from Japan, how you see affinities or competition or the way to differentiate yourself, right? So all of those things kind of take us down to, I mentioned this sort of, whether you are a pressure movement from the outside or whether you're a force in electoral politics. All these things sort of frame like what it is to be part of a normal nationalism, or to be a nationalist activist. What does that mean, right? This is sort of the old school style of right-wing activism. In addition to driving around, they'd also post up at train stations and give speeches. And many of you have probably heard this. Some of the oratory is really fascinating and really interesting, but you kind of get a sense of their politics from the flags that are there. From the right, Soka Gakkai, Bokumetsu, like destroy the Soka Gakkai, right? Daitowa Senso wa Jisonji no Senso. The Greater East Asian War was a war of self-defense and self-preservation. Kutsujoku Kenpo Kaisei, revise the insulting constitution, right? Tokyo Saiban Shikan Shoku, get rid of the view of history based on the Tokyo Tribunal, right? The victor's justice that said that leaders of the country were Class A war criminals, right? We can talk about their issues if you like afterwards. And so you have this set of political positions and historical positions that they represent, but you also have this sort of divide. On the top, the slogan on a sound truck saying "one man, one kill" sounds really scary, right? The Abe assassination is an example of that, even though he wasn't from the far right. On the other side, you have things that might seem a little bit funny, right? This is right-wing group members outside of Shibuya Station getting signatures to reject Ueno Zoo renewing their lease for Chinese pandas, right? So there's a wide variety of things that become, part of that ideological position. The article that's linked there is one in which I describe these different factions. Between the old right and the new right and the ACM, the nativist right, the kind of online right that emerged in the 2010s. It's a generational shift, but it's also a methodological shift and also a shift in the way that these groups saw their relationship to society, what kinds of activism was appropriate, what's their relationship to violence, and things like that. So I want to run through these three groups, each in turn really quickly, and then come back to some concluding thoughts about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about extremism. So the old right were basically a post-World War II development. As I mentioned, Cold War period, anti-communism and defending the emperor were the main kind of common denominators for these groups. As a result, they were grudgingly pro-US, which is really interesting about face, right? If you think about the end of World War II to, say, the early 1950s. They often overlapped a lot with organized crime groups, and this was partially because they were brought in as strikebreakers and thugs and muscle by mainstream Japan when there were really large-scale labor and left-wing movements that, by numbers, were vastly much larger than anything on the right. So if you think about 1960 AMPO, if you think about mining strikes in the 1950s, railway strikes in the 1950s, these kinds of events, because they draw from organized crime, there's actually an overrepresentation of former colonial subjects and ethnic others, right? So one of the things that people who were former colonial subjects did to make ends meet after the rug was pulled out from them, like everybody else, was there were some organized crime groups that were basically ethnic associations, right? Taiwanese gangs, former Korean gangs. And as those gangs got sort of solidified into structures, and as those structures became called upon to supply muscle, you found, for instance, the figure of the ethnic Korean far-right Japanese activist, which sounds kind of mind-boggling on its surface, but I've met these students, they exist. So again, they're aggressive sound truck parades, faux military uniforms, but not often, they feel very violent, but they're not often engaging in direct violence, right? It's mostly sort of sound and fury type activism. Here's an example of some of the sound trucks that you used to see. This is in front of Ikebukuro Station. Anti-teachers union, teachers being leftists, right? Anti-Russia, give us back the Northern Territories, etc. You might recognize this familiar face. So one sort of standard bearing group of the old right would be the Dainippon Aikokuto, the All Japan Patriot Party, and this was their chairman, former politician turned activist. In 1964, when the Beatles first came to Japan, they went and protested the Beatles coming to Japan, right? I like this. Beatles, go home. Beatles will tataki dase. Beat them up and toss them out. To give a sense of what this looks like for these guys, this sort of parade, multiple trucks. I'll turn down the sound. This is a video that I took riding around in one of these trucks. So how do you do research on them? You know, you go to their protests with them, visit people in jail if they commit crimes during activism, go to these sorts of drinking parties, and so forth. That's me in the middle with a little bit more hair, probably, I don't know, in 2007 or something like that. That said, though, there were moments where very extreme events happened based in people who were associated with these types of groups, right? So this is Yamaguchi Otoya, who many of you may know. In 1960, on live television, he assassinated the head of the Socialist Party. And it's interesting, though, that this is a very extreme event, right? Assassination on live TV, right? But what's interesting is that he made it very clear that he acted as an individual. He was moved to do this, you know, in his heart, he knew he had to do this type thing. And he left his group officially before he did this, right? He made it clear that this wasn't the group, this was the individual, right? I think it's an important distinction to think about when we consider the potential pressure or suppression that a group could have based on that, right? Okay, next wing. This is the new right. They're getting started in the 1970s. And who are they? You might recognize Mishima Yukio in those photos. He's the author who turned into a nationalist ideologue and then tried to encouraged the self-defense force to overthrow the Japanese government in November 1970. It didn't work. They said, no, we're not going to do this, laughed at him. And then he went in and committed seppuku and had his head cut off, the whole deal. He inspired, however, the activists who were to go on and create the new right. These were students at the time, or just recently graduated people at the time in the early 1970s, who had been involved in anti-student movement activism on their college campuses. And as many of you might know, Mishima had his own private army. And one of the guys who died with him on that day in Ichigaya was one of the members of this private army. He was also a former student activist. So people who had been engaged in activism with him said, okay, what can we do to help make the Japan that we'd like to live in, and founded what became the New Right. So they took a lot from the New Left. They were critical of the old right and its organization, a relation to organized crime, its relation to political orthodoxy in Japan. They said that we are going to be like the leftists and be radical. We're going to critique these old structures and institutions and do something that's more to the moment. The US has the Vietnam War, but aren't they just bombing Asians? Can't we do something that's like in line with our heritage of liberating Asia, right? And so they were actively anti-US. Nomura Shusuke, who I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, as well as Mishima Yukio, are kind of really high-profile people who would be associated with the New Right. But they were basically intellectually oriented. They were very anti-establishment. They were radical and engaged in different kinds of direct action. And they were international. They started to act internationally and make connections internationally, whereas the pre-existing right stayed pretty much at home. What's an example of what that looks like? During the first Gulf War, the old right took part in protests like this. Down with Iraq, encouraged the USA. Saddam Hussein is the pirate of Arabia, right? The new right was saying, no, the Gulf War is an example of US imperialism, the same kind of US imperialism that took over Okinawa and has bases in our country, the same US imperialism that our leaders let happen, right? So it's a pretty different position, and it brings it closer to the critique that people on the left would make. This is, for instance, the current leader of one of the standard-bearing groups for the new right, Isuikai. This is at the 2008 G8 summit in Hokkaido. We're due for a G7 right about now. And you can kind of make it out in this photo, but he's standing on an image of George W. Bush as he's giving his speeches the whole time there in Hokkaido. I'm going to skip ahead. A more recent development is what many people call the ACM, or the Action Conservative Movement. They're kind of a nativist movement. And they came from online organizing to a large extent, but oftentimes people who had been involved in other kinds of rightist activism before then jumped onto this, right? So there were some people that were brand new to activism, where the internet was a place where they were mobilized, and other people that were kind of activist entrepreneurs that found a new venue for like potentials, right? They emerged in the mid-2000s, basically along the beginnings of widespread internet use in Japan. They were pretty mainstream, pretty white collar, but feeling disaffected, the sort of populism that in some ways characterizes things like the Green Tea movement, or the Green Tea Party. Sorry, the Tea Party in the US, I guess they would be like the Green Tea Party for Japan. And also domestic revisionisms and backlash politics, say like anti-Korean activism in Japan, anti-resident Korean activism in Japan, getting into fights with Korean nationalists or Chinese nationalists, things like that. And they saw themselves not as, we are from the margins trying to force the political conversation that people are afraid to have, but rather we are the sort of silent majority from the center who's going to say the things that we can say online anonymously that people are afraid to say, in the mainstream news, right? So it kind of parallels, I think, right-wing movements in the US to a certain degree. It happened on places like 2chan, right? The now is like 4chan, 8chan, how many chans are we at? 32 chans yet? I'm not sure. But anonymous message boards that were really open-ended, right? And they offered uncensored and unfettered communication, and they became rife with racism, but also racism and trolling as a sport in the 2000s. That moved to this online world through things like streaming video in Nico Nico Doga, and that's the parallel of YouTube in Japan. And they moved from this online organizing to real explicit offline organizing like this. You can see here that the caption to this video is in English. The subtitles are in English. They were explicitly aware that by acting online, the things that they do can be iterative and come back, right? And be remade and re-edited and reshown over and over again, and aren't limited to the moment where the activism takes place, right? So this is in 2013, where groups that were part of this Action Conservative movement were kind of at their height. This is a staging at a park in Kabukicho, right below Okubo, the ethnic Korean neighborhood in Tokyo. And they're staging there, surrounded by police and all these sorts of other people, to go then do a march through the ethnic Korean neighborhood saying, you know, the comfort women were all prostitutes and Koreans are cockroaches and all these horrible things, right? We can talk about this later, but this was a time that you had anti-hate speech movements happening and people going to like fight the racist. You had anti-racist right-wingers fighting against racist right-wingers, like this whole kind of sort of hashing out of what it means to be taking a nationalist position in activism, and what view of Japanese society is it? Is it a mono-ethnic one? If you are basing your nationalism in Japanese empire, that's multi-ethnic, right? So even from the nationalist perspective, there's different ways to understand what it means to be properly Japanese, right? These guys have moved out into political campaigning and election sort of attempts to become sort of mainstream far-right politicians to varying successes. Similarly, back for the new right, a group that I skipped over because I'm trying to make sure I finish by 35. Hariya Daisuke, this particular guy here, just in the last election, he ran for office as a mainstream politician, despite being somebody who's had National Police Agency's officers following him for the last 30 years, right? Because he's seen as an extremist, right? So what I hope to give us something to think about and we can chat about during the Q&A is that when we say extremism, there's lots of different things that we have to unpack, right? What are the relationships with authorities, policing, or symbolic figures like the emperor? What are the relationship that they imagine with lay society or with the average citizen, right? Are they antagonistic, or are they trying to speak for or toward or against, right? What are the relationships with other domestic or international activisms? And all of the people that I mentioned today have different, slightly different angles on that. What's their ideological basis, whether it's in political or religious thought, or whether it's a mix of those things? And based on that, right, again, you have an answer to who's the object or the audience of their activism, right? Sometimes when far-right group members commit something, do something against the law, they say, the law that's active in Japan right now is the law that was written by the Americans, and we reject that law. I was acting as an imperial subject. That's the only authority I recognize, right? So it can shift even in that sort of ideological frame, the way that people imagine what they're allowed to do and what their responsibility is for things that they do. Are these issue-based activism, or are they identity-based activism, or do those things bleed together, right? Similarly, are you pressuring, rejecting, or joining the legislative system, the capitalist system, or lay mainstream society, right? When you think about forms of violence and methods of activism, there's a case to be made that analog is truer and more old school and more real, and you have to mano a mano, face-to-face, engage with people in their true form, right? That puts up a pretty high hurdle to participation. So digital activism has reach, it has a lower threshold, right? And it has a lot more potential, but it's also hard to get traction there too. So when we say extremism, does hate speech online qualify as extremism in a way that, say, yelling at somebody where they can't block it out of their earshot in front of a train station? Not, right? When is activism a full-time job versus something that you do on the weekend as a hobby, right? On big anniversaries, when there's an issue or something that happens, right? What happens over generations? Some groups come into being and dissipate. Other groups sort of have, multiple heads and succession issues and trying to figure out how they reframe themselves for new eras. And then lastly, I think one other thing that always comes back to me as I've been looking at extremist activism and far-right activism in Japan in particular is what's the relationship between individual activity and group activity, right? Where does the group serve as a vessel for certain things, and where does the individual sort of process that and take that and do with that, a variety of different options. And just lastly, to conclude, if you're interested in these topics, there are 3 books that I would really recommend. One is more historical. This is Eiko Maruko Seniawa's Ruffians, Yakuza, and Nationalists. I'll kind of scroll through this a little bit during the Q&A so people can see them. The next is about women activists during the student movement by Chelsea Shinji Scheider at Aoyama Gakuin. It's also quite recent and really wonderful. And then this about sort of extremist groups, mostly on the left and or anarchist side, but a little bit from the right, is William Andrews' Dissenting Japan, A History of Japanese Radicalism and Counterculture. So I'll conclude there, and I look forward to answering as many questions as I can and hearing from you as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for your time today. This presentation was really, really interesting, and we also have some really good questions today. But to start off, I wanted to ask, so considering the pipe bomb incident that happened towards Prime Minister Kishida, and also the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe, would these attempts be blamed on the violent left, like you mentioned early in your presentation, or would these incidents be blamed on the right?
I think the issue with Abe was tricky because, and in the moment that it happened, people weren't really sure, right, what the ideological motivation of this person was, right? And so people that were on the left and the activist left were really quickly saying things like on Twitter, we decry violence in all its forms and we critique Abe, to the day we die, but we would never use these kinds of tactics, right? There were people on the far right that I follow on Twitter saying, this is probably a leftist, or what if it's a Korean, or this kind of thing, right? And kind of insinuating different things. So it was really hard to see. I think for Kishida's guy, there's some stuff that's come out to sort of show that he was moving more in right-wing ecosystems, but I haven't seen anything that places him within a particular group. And again, this is sort of like the potential for the internet to kind of, offer people a whole host of information without having to like go to the study group and interact with, potentially scary people.
I see. So do you foresee then these kind of individuals taking these kind of extreme approach towards like showing the way that they feel, or they're being dissatisfied with, let's say, politicians or political parties then?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a much stronger and longstanding history in Japan of far right people targeting politicians and doing that. But Japanese politics has been for a long time, particularly in the pre-war, very, very violent. In the post-war, the violence from the right has mostly targeted people that have power. And one of the ways that they critique violence from the left is that they'll say that the violence from the left is potentially like more open-ended or something like that, or it's leftists targeting leftists and the rightists aren't doing that because they all get along, right? And the leftists are too factional. I don't know, but I think it's hard to say that there is a particular ideological position that generates or justifies violence more than another. The right, I think, has probably been more active than the left over the course of the post-war period.
I see. Well, so Alexandria, she asked, can you speak a little bit on like the right wing versus the left wing in Japan? Because it was surprising to her, or that some of these like far right figures have pushed for what you might consider reforms for workers. And then on the political spectrum, it looks more like a horseshoe, but do the Japanese conceptualize like these kinds of poles?
Yeah, one really, really interesting figure who recently passed away was Suzuki Kunio. And he was really, really deeply associated with the New Right. He founded one of the founding members of the group Isuikai that I mentioned. during the talk. And Suzuki himself later in life was criticized and by people on the right and said, like, I'm no longer a rightist. Like, I see that there are too many problems with the right. If anything, I'm a liberal or maybe a leftist. He died earlier this year, and a lot of the memorialization of him has come from the left and from people who are not on the right, partially because of that. So there is a sort of a truism that, if you go far enough to the left, then you'll meet up on the right, and vice versa. But really, for people like Suzuki Kunio and for the new right, they were seeing their connections with the left based in things like strategies and things like how you see the relationship to the United States, things like how you see your relationship to mainstream political orthodoxy in Japan. And the right, as the right was sort of, I don't want to say bought and sold, but at best didn't always have the ability or to reject being part of the political establishment, that people who were dissatisfied with that saw something in radicalism that was freeing and liberating and allowed them to sort of express things that they thought weren't being expressed on the right, but should be part of the right. In terms of, right-wing people talking about workers and so forth, there's a strain of populism in lots of right-wing activism around the world. And it's interesting to think about sort of, where you can find connections and common ground between right-wing and left-wing positions. For Nomura Shusuke talking about why he would go after the Japan Business Federation, this goes back to, pre-war Japan. There were far right-wing activists in like the 515 incident, Ketsumedan, other things that were going after industrialists, right, and saying that the capitalists were taking advantage of Japanese people in league with the politicians who weren't doing the right thing, right? What they want by doing that takes in a different direction than maybe what the left would want, but some of the rhetoric can be very similar.
I see. So we also have a question with regards to like the right-wing trucks. Peggy asked, are these trucks protected by the police? This is a rumor, I guess, but is this true?
Yeah, so anybody who is doing public political activism in Japan pretty much has permission. You apply and you say what you want to do, and you're allowed to do it, right, within certain parameters. So right-wing sound trucks that are just driving around don't have explicit police permission, but if they're doing like a big parade of trucks and that kind of thing, there are always people from the NPA there monitoring things and knowing who's going to go where. One of the differences between the old right and the new right was that the new right people don't really get along with the police very well. And in fact, the police that are in charge of them are the police that are in charge of the far left radicals too. So the old school right-wing guys, the police that are in charge of them are the police that are in charge of organized crime. And so when I would go to the protest for, say, old school right-wing groups like the old right, the leaders were, just chatting like chums with the cops that were there to monitor them because they're used to chatting with them all the time, right? And it's that kind of bravado, like, yeah, we're going to talk with you. For the new right, usually the police were at a bit of a distance and they weren't chummy and chatting back and forth. But that said, there are examples to the opposite. And there are, for instance, the same police officer will be assigned to a certain activist for a long time. And so people know each other, right? But basically, I would say it's not that police protect them so much as that police are always monitoring them and know where they are. And if people just go off and start doing activism, the police show up and will not be happy about it, right? But usually they say, okay, hey, we're going to go do this thing. And the police know to be there. And that's part of the, my impression of it is it's part of the kind of like gentleman's agreement that the police are there to do their job. And if anything gets out of hand, then the police are there to protect the public, right? And the activists can still do their activism.
That's really interesting.
I just wanted to add that I live near Yasukuni many years now. And a lot of the ultra-rightist sound trucks people use the property, use the driveway, and the police who are part of the political establishment supporting Yasukuni tend to turn a blind eye or actually be very supportive of some of these sound truck or ultra-rightist people.
They're on their best behavior when they're at Yasukuni too, quite often, right? And so, like I said, when I first came to Japan, I was living at Sophia University, and that area around Yotsuya was the last part where they'd be really, really loud. And then when they come and turn the corner in front of the Imperial Palace, they kind of settle down a little bit, right? When you come to, say, like August 15th at Yasukuni, that's a wild circus, right? There are people there to pay their respects. There are people there to see the political spectacle. There are activists from different sides who either want to be there to stop a disruption or to start a disruption, right? And I've seen rightists go and beat up leftists who come into Yasukuni Shrine on August 15th and things like that, right? So in that case, that was a moment where I was like, wait, why aren't the police stopping them from beating up that guy? They would have a really hard time stopping them from beating up that guy. And the police are also happy to have the leftist person out of Yasukuni. And that's what the right was doing. Once they're out, then the police will kind of separate people out. So it's kind of weird. I feel like in general, the left is under much more extreme political pressure than the right is in Japan. But in general, the right sort of knows the line that they're allowed to go up into. And then when they cross it, same with organized crime, when they cross it, then they get sanctions and stuff. And sometimes they cross it to make a point, right? A symbolic, practical point.
So kind of like piggyback off that, Patricia asked, so why are the trucks so loud? And same applies to like the candidate trucks around election time. Like, what is the relevance of them being so noisy?
Yeah, well, it's funny because the candidate trucks at around election time, that's the one time of the year that you don't see the right-wing trucks, because that's the one time of the year that they'll get in trouble for putting those trucks out there because they're not running for election. And so election law trumps, their freedom of speech to go out and yell about something. But that the idea of the sound truck as a mode of right-wing activism is something that started with Akao Bin, the guy who I mentioned really briefly, and he was a former politician. And so his longstanding thing, if I can pull up my slides again, where did it go? Oops. His longstanding thing was doing street oratory in front of at the Ginza at Sukiyabashi. And that became sort of like the standard bearing form of right-wing activism for a really long time. That's this image here, right? So through the 50s, 60s, 70s, he did it until he died. And that was what started out. So the parallel between this truck and, say, this truck decades and decades later, is not lost on somebody who's part of that world. Why are they so loud? There's a really great anthropologist named Ikuya Sato who wrote a book about Bosozoku groups, like the motorcycle guys. And he said that the reason why they're so loud is because they like to medatsu. It's about showing off and being very public and, putting yourself into the presence of the public, right? And yeah, I mean, I think it's fun. I've ridden around in the trucks, like being really awfully loud. There's something that, there was a question about where are all the women? It seems like a boys' club. Yeah, definitely. And all these guys are like rolling coal, and like Harleys or something like that. It's a really aesthetically kind of pleasing form of empowerment for them, right? The other thing is, why is the sound quality so bad? I think it's partially that, to feel kind of scary, right? So the sound truck as a mode of right-wing activism came to be used in activism, not just street oratory, when there were these big left-wing and mainstream and labor protests. And if you have tens of thousands of people, you're not going to have tens of thousands of rightists to go fight against them or scare them or something like that. But a big truck with one guy to drive it and one guy to scream on the microphone is pretty intimidating, right? So the sound truck was sort of, I think it's a remnant of basically really large scale activism that was not on the right, and the right saying, okay, what can we do to make it seem like we've got numbers and volume? It's volume, right? In speakers, not in people.
So then, Elizabeth wants to ask, so where do you draw the line between like patriotism and the love of your country, and then like hence defense and preservation of heritage from what is now considered like right-wing extremism?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. So in Japanese, and this is something that right-wing activists have grappled with quite a lot. The person I mentioned who died, Suzuki Kunio, has written books about this. So patriotism just straight up is aikoku, right? Like love of country, right? But for Mishima Yukio, he really liked this phrase. Oops, I got the wrong. This one, yukoku. Some of you might have heard this. So yukoku is sort of like worry for your country, right? It's like you take the anxiety of your country. You're at pain thinking about your country kind of thing, right? And so the right winger will often say, okay, if mainstream Japanese people don't like the fact that we ride around and yell and make a spectacle of ourselves, right? We want them to show aikoku shin, patriotism, right? That's like standing up and listening to the anthem and raising the flag and that kind of thing. But we activists have to be able to cultivate this idea of yukoku activism, like this worry for the nation, this thing that like deeply emotionally affects you, this thing that might spur you to assassinate somebody or crash your truck into something or cut off your finger and mail it to a politician or, slit open your belly at the Self-Defense Force headquarters, right? So there's ways of understanding patriotism that map onto different emotional things and different action things. Like, are you being a good citizen, or are you like feeding the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots, right? There's lots of different definitions of these things.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting like correlation, because it makes me think in that case, like a group like SEALD, who, clearly they organized because they were concerned about their country, would you say that would you foresee there ever being a student-led group like that ever again, considering that even though there's not this sense of like, we need to worry about like defense and security so much anymore, or at least not through, Prime Minister Kishida, but like perhaps, the worry about the future, like the economy and like, the birth rate and things of that nature. Do you foresee something like that being organized by students?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like SEALDS was really refreshing and interesting. And in interviews with them, a lot of them were high school students, right? And their older brothers and sisters had been involved in anti-nuclear activism, a few years before, 4 years before. And so they saw that as a possibility. And when one of the interesting things about the anti-nuclear post-3/11 movement was that there have been anti-nuclear movements in Japan for a really long time, but they were old people. They were the same like peace activists. They were the same kind of left-wing activists. And after 3/11, the people who organized the big protests and things that were happening in Tokyo, in Koenji, the sit-in in front of the prime minister's residence, things like that, they were coming from subcultures. They were coming from music subcultures. Noriko Manabe wrote a really great book about it called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. That's all about sound and music and all these innovative forms of activism. But the reason why they had these innovative forms of activism was that they weren't the old school activists, right? So when SEALDS came out, one of the things that they said explicitly when they were forming their group was that we are just organizing around this redefinition of collective self-defense. And if that succeeds, then great, we'll disband. If that fails, then great, we'll disband. That was really interesting because they were saying that this is not like a lifetime vocation, right? But what it does open up the possibility for is something like you suggest, right? To say that here's an issue, here's something that we need to organize. And it belies a certain kind of political sensibility and awareness that I think people didn't give young people in Japan enough credit for in previous years.
So then Benjamin Tracy wants to know, do you foresee any new political groups growing in the coming years?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like right now the more kind of interesting things that are happening are, I wonder what's going to happen with Sanseito, this sort of like kind of populist party that hasn't really done super well electorally yet, but you see posters around different places. They are kind of like a vague big umbrella group for people that are on the kind of very online right world. The thing that I'm watching and a little bit worried about is if mainstream LDP conservatism, which is a big tent kind of conservatism, takes what I think is pretty savvy marketing from people like Sanseto and tries to tack right, sort of the way that the Republican Party had to do to respond to Trump. Even, feeling kind of like false in doing it, right, but still doing it. And so if anything, I feel like that potential is something to keep an eye on. In terms of sort of things that might be classed on the left, I feel like it's much more about issue-based things, right? So whether it's about gay rights, whether it's about having two names for married couples, whether it's about women's rights, things like that, it becomes issue-based, not like we are an ideological position, but we take all of these positions on lots of different issues. And I want to see how those things get operationalized. On the far right lately in Japan, there have been more attention to things like transgender issues and things like that. And trans issues were something that were completely off the radar of the Japanese far right for a long time. But I think sort of that interaction allowed by the internet and interacting with what's going on in real time in the United States has helped to propel those issues back and forth. And so that kind of convergence and coalescence is something that's worth, I think, paying attention to.
So we have so many more questions, but we don't have so much time. I guess for just wrapping up some final thoughts, do you think that there are right-wing extremists in, like, say, the Japanese Self-Defense Force? This was a question that was asked by Fabian Lucas.
Right-wing groups really like to think that. They really like that idea. Anybody who's been associated with the Self-Defense Force, if they say something that's like vaguely right-wing, they become sort of like little heroes, right? Even Tamogami, right, is a huge example of this, but somebody who has a profile and is a sanctioned person within the Japanese military saying something that fits with kind of like right-wing principles, that's just like, I don't know, catnip, right? So every once in a while I had run into people who were active self-defense force people involved in some of the less extreme, more kind of like open, like let's have a study group kind of activities. And it was like, okay, that person, you can't say what their real job is because they are actually active. And so they're doing something a little bit dangerous by being here. That was really, really, really rare though. And so I think in general, my impression of people, you all have had much more interactions than I have, but my impression of people in the self-defense force is they're very, very, very professional. And that political activism, is a huge no-no. And so even if you do have affinities for whatever political stripe, you probably wait, or you keep it pretty much in your private life. So even when there was somebody who you knew had something, they really resisted, and the groups themselves didn't want to pressure anybody to out themselves because it was just, that's not worth it. They'd much rather have the idea that there's people on the inside who believe what we believe, and they felt great about that.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much again, Professor Smith, for your presentation today and taking time out of your evening to be with us. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of them today.
It's my fault.
No worries. Thank you so much, Professor Smith. And lastly, I want to present some upcoming events. But before I do, everyone, so if you would like to check out the article that Professor Smith has written, it's in the chat. Additionally, Professor Smith, would you be interested in sharing your slides with the chat? A few people have requested that. Would that be okay?
Let me see. Actually, probably this is eventually going to be up online, yeah? That's probably better. Instead of having it circulating just as a PDF or something, I'd rather have it be part of the video that shows up eventually on YouTube.
Okay, understood. Okay, so everyone, lastly, I want to share some events.
Mike Perrin, your comment is right on for sure. I did 3 years of field work at Yasukuni Shrine with their youth group. So yeah.
So the next The next Getting to Know Japan webinar, which will be coming after the Golden Week holidays, is Japan as a Maritime Nation. This will be Thursday, May 11th at 1900 Japan Standard Time. Commander John Bradford will be the speaker for this event. So this is online on Zoom. We hope you will join us for that. The next event we have for the Getting to Know Japan webinars is Perry's Black Ships and the Influence on Japanese Culture. This will be May 16th, Tuesday, May 16th at 10 a.m. Japan Standard Time. We have Captain Keizo Kitagawa, who will be the speaker for this event. So we hope once again that you will join us online for these Zoom webinars. For our next in-person event, which is for the community conversation, it is on the alliance politics and an age of great power rivalry implications for the U.S.-Japan alliance. Once again, this is in person. So if you happen to be in the Fusa area, please join us for that. This will be Thursday, May 18th. They will begin at 17:30 with refreshments, and the seminar will start at 18:15. And Takuya Matsuda will be the speaker for this event. So once again, if you are in the area or if you're able to join us online, we hope you will join us for these upcoming events, both for the Getting to Know Japan webinar series and community conversation. Once again, we thank you so much, Professor Smith, for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you will see us after the you will join us again after the Golden Week holidays on May 11th. So thank you so much. We hope you have a nice evening. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.